Hello, I'm Rudyard Griffiths, the host and moderator of the Monk Dialogues. Welcome to our last program of 2020. This has been such a terrific year. 20 shows to spend with you talking about the big issues and ideas changing our world. We've had some great guests on over the course of 2020. Malcolm Gladwell kicking us off, who could forget that, back in April. Fareed Zakaria, David Brooks, Samantha Power, the list goes on and on. Just a reminder about this dialogue, and really all of our dialogues. These shows are not debates. If you want to debate, we've got tons of them on our website. We do them every week on our podcast. The purpose of the dialogues is really to expose you, the audience, to different points of view, different ideas about the world. You can take or leave those ideas. The purpose of these programs, though, is to challenge ourselves, to think hard about complicated issues. On this, the final installment of the Monk Dialogues for 2020, we are exceedingly fortunate to have a really interesting, original thinker on the program. Her name is Bari Weiss. She's a journalist, author, and free speech advocate. She's been a writer and editor at a whole number of prestigious publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And she's the internationally best-selling author of How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Bari Weiss joins us now for a Monk Dialogue.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I've been really looking forward to this conversation, Bari. Over the last number of weeks since the US election, we've been exploring ideas around the future of democracy. You've got a bunch of, I think, compelling and interesting arguments for us to ponder today about the nature of free speech, how we form decisions, understandings amongst each other or not, the nature of media and journalism in our time. Bari, what I want to do for the first 20 minutes or so with you as we bat around some of those ideas is put up on our quote board here some quotes that you've said that I think capture some of your thinking today. And the first of these, I'll read it to you, is the following. You wrote this in 2020, I believe. Criticism is great. What cancel culture is about is not criticism. It's about punishment. It's about making a person radioactive. Bari, kick off for us. What was the thinking behind that? And maybe talk a little bit about your own personal experience, how becoming radioactive is something more than just words for you. It's something that kind of happened to you in the course of your own journalistic career.
Sure. Well, I would say that there's a very strange paradox that exists right now, not just in America, not just in Canada, but in the West more generally. Speaking of America and Canada, we live in the freest societies in the history of the world by any measure. And yet, people are acting increasingly as if we are living in a closed society. So what do I mean by that? I know a lot of closeted people, and I don't mean closeted in their gender identity or their sexual orientation. I mean closeted in their commonsensical views of the world. Feminists who believe that there are biological differences between men and women, parents who want their children to go to schools where they're taught to judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, lawyers who believe in equality under the law, professors who want the right to research and write and speak without fear of censure. And if that sounds crazy, frankly, people have their heads in the sand. And the reason that these people are so scared, the reason they write me and say things like, I know this sounds crazy, but I feel like I'm living in a totalitarian society, they're not crazy. What they fear is what we call cancellation, which is really a mechanism of power and of social censure of this zealous cabal that is, in my view, the sort of most powerful ideology that's emerged in the West since the end of the Cold War. It's been called critical social justice, it's been called wokeness, it's been called identity politics, intersectionality, neo-Marxism. It doesn't yet have a commonly agreed upon name, but essentially what it's trying to do is to radically narrow the Overton window of what's an acceptable thought and what's acceptable behavior. And the skeptic will say, listen, every society, every tribe, every social group has always had taboos. And of course they would be right. They're right. There always have been taboos. What's different about this modern iteration is that people are getting canceled for sins that are not really sins. And it uses the power of the thing that we're talking to each other through right now, the internet, in which, in a kind of panopticon dystopian sense, in which everything is recorded for all time and forever. So someone in the old world, let's say, might have been canceled for something like pedophilia, and that would have been legitimate. They would have been ostracized for that. Today, someone can be canceled. They could suffer, and what do I mean by that? They could lose their job. They could suffer, horrific social, reputational harm, and their family and their friends can be subjected to a secondary boycott for something as simple as liking the wrong tweet. And it's a strange fact that we're living in an era in which and by we I mean progressives, liberals, even many conservatives, we believe increasingly in rehabilitation, in criminal justice reform, in the idea that people who have even committed murder or rape deserve a second chance. And yet there's no similar mode of rehabilitation for people that are canceled in this kind of public way, if that makes sense.
It does, Bari. And what would your response be to the person who says, though, that these are perilous times, that we live in a society that has gone from mere divisions to rampant polarization, and that polarization occasionally spills over into violence. It spills over into violence that targets minority and vulnerable groups, and that violence starts with words. So we need to be careful about our words, because those things have consequences, and in some cases, life-threatening consequences for those vulnerable communities.
I guess what I would point them to are stories of people that, to my mind, show that the effect of what cancel culture is. So I would start by saying, what do you make then of Emmanuel Cafferty, the Hispanic utility worker who worked at the San Diego Gas and Electric Company, who was fired this summer because he made an okay hand gesture hanging out the window of his car, and someone interpreted it as a white supremacist hand gesture made by a Hispanic man, and he was fired? What would they say to Tiffany Riley? She's a Vermont school principal who was fired because she said over the summer, I support the idea, of course, of Black Lives Matter, but not the organization Black Lives Matter. She lost her job. What would they say to, I could point to a zillion examples. Greg Patton is a favorite example of mine. He was a professor of business communication at USC, or at least he was until this fall when he lost his job. And why did he lose his job? He was teaching a class about business communication, and he was teaching a class about filler words like and that and things like that. And he used a word in Chinese, a Chinese word that is a filler word that sounds a lot like the N-word, the most horrible racial slur in the English language. That's not what he said. He was fired for his job for using a Chinese word that sounded like a racial slur. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, again, the kind of things that should rightly be social taboo. It should be a social taboo to use the N-word in your workplace or on social media. Of course it should. But that should not extend to the example that I just showed you. I think what we're seeing a lot of, and I could speak right now to what happened at the New York Times, is the weaponization of the idea of safety and the concept creep of what constitutes violence. So we have this very strange ideology in force right now inside many of our liberal institutions, in which many people say words are violence, and yet violence, including rioting and looting, is not actually violence. And that's a very, very strange place to be. The way that this exploded in my own life, in an example that I imagine lots of your viewers have heard of, was when the New York Times in June ran an op-ed by a sitting United States Senator named Tom Cotton, a Republican. And in it, he called for using the National Guard not to put down peaceful protesters, but to put down armed and violent rioting that took place in many American cities over the summer. Controversial op-ed, no doubt, but it was a view then held, according to polls, by more than 60% of the American population. And you would think that the New York Times, as the paper of record, would want to be in the business of exposing our readers to lots of views across the political spectrum. What happened after we ran that op-ed is that more than 800 employees of the New York Times signed a petition saying that that op-ed put the lives of Black Americans, and specifically the lives of Black New York Times employees, in danger. I'm not saying that words can't cause harm. God knows that I've suffered harm from words. But the idea that an op-ed could be weaponized in that way, which ultimately led to the forced resignation of my boss for having the temerity to run an op-ed by a sitting United States senator, to me shows that we're living in an era with a very dangerous and chilling spirit. One in which censoriousness has replaced open dialogue, in which persuasion has been replaced with public shaming, in which the idea of debate has been replaced with deplatforming. And one of the things I find so strange is that journalists, people whose trade is curiosity and open-mindedness, that's the coin of the realm, are oftentimes calling for this sort of censorship themselves.
Bari, that's a great segue to go to our second quote of yours, just to flesh out our discussion together. The truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few whose job it is to inform everyone else. Maybe you could use that as a jumping off point to talk about your kind of broader criticism of the mainstream media today and how it's approaching difficult and contested debates in our society.
Sure. My argument would be, and it's, I think, a pretty boring and old school one, but apparently it's controversial these days, is that the public conversation, and not just the public conversation, but progress, benefits when we have the most expansive and capacious public dialogue about sensitive issues as is possible. Right now, we are living in an era in which what political scientists call the Overton window of acceptable debate has narrowed to something like a sliver. What do I mean by that? I mean, not, the Tom Cotton example is a great one, but there were op-eds I tried to get through as an editor at the New York Times arguing, for example, that there would be a reason to support Brexit other than xenophobia or hatred of immigrants. There would be reasons for people to vote for Donald Trump other than white identity politics or racism. Those kind of arguments are increasingly hard to smuggle through the legacy media channels. And I think that, you see the effect of it when, just look a few, weeks ago, God, I've lost track of time in COVID, where the press, the legacy press, and all of the pundits, all of the pointy heads in America told us there was going to be this massive blue wave. And in fact, what happened was not a blue wave, and there was a record number of minorities in America that voted for Trump, arguably the most controversial Republican in living memory, maybe in all of American history. Why? If you read the New York Times, you would think that the only reason to vote for Donald Trump are these horrific reasons that I just expressed to you before. It is a problem when the paper of record, and I'm not just speaking now about the New York Times, I'm speaking about the legacy press in general, does not accurately reflect the world as it is to our readers, but reflect the world as we want it to be. It's a little bit like socialist realist art. It's newspapering and journalism for the sake of pushing a particular political narrative rather than for the sake of exposing our readers to the widest range of ideas and news and truth, even when that truth is inconvenient. And the reason for that is not just that people are invested in this profoundly ideological movement, which we could talk more about. It's also the business incentive, which is something I don't think we talk enough about when we talk about this topic. Remember that the old model for news media was the advertising model. You had to fear, if you were an editor or a writer, angering the advertiser. That's no longer the case because of the internet. The boss of the New York Times is the subscriber, is the reader.
Right.
And if you look at recent polls, more than 90% of New York Times readers, and I don't mean to keep harping on the New York Times, it's just the example I know
Sure.
best. We could talk about MSNBC, similar numbers, and Fox, obviously the mirror image in the opposite direction. More than 90% of New York Times readers identify as liberals and Democrats. So you know that you will make your readers happy by continuing to serve them outrage porn over the president or over the Republican Party because they're already there. It's like feeding them a hit of heroin. And I know that even as an editor and as a writer myself, all of the incentives point in that direction. Because you know, if you're a columnist, well, what's your goal as a columnist? You want to be widely read. You want to go viral. You want everyone to talk about the piece that you've written. The surest way to do that, and I felt this very strongly myself, was to write yet another piece about how horrible Donald Trump was. And God knows I felt that way, just like many of my colleagues did. But I think that the best and highest use of journalism isn't simply to tell readers what they want to hear. The problem is that is what the business model right now is pushing toward. And right now, we don't have a good alternative business model that incentivizes, frankly, things that cut against the grain, that go in the opposite direction, that anger our readers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, these are great insights, Bari. I want to, before we move to audience questions, put up another quote board from you. I think it's a great kind of summation of your views on journalism today. Rule number 1, speak your mind at your own peril. Rule number 2, never risk commissioning a story that goes against the narrative. Rule number 3, never believe an editor or publisher who urges you to go against the grain. Eventually, the publisher will cave to the mob, the editor will get fired or reassigned, and you'll be hung out to dry. Bari, what is your advice to journalists today, and especially to people who are, considering what many feel is an important profession, not just, because it gives you opportunities to express yourself, but as you've just discussed, it's a profession that should fulfill a public good. Can we kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Are you at all optimistic? That quote would suggest you have a deep cynicism about the state of the press today.
I'm the least cynical person in the world. For those who know me, I'm like a little bit, honestly, naive sometimes. I've been hardened by what I saw inside the legacy press, but I would say I'm more optimistic than ever when it comes to journalism. It's just, can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again inside institutions that have been rotted out or that have been subsumed by this ideology, or rather that are run by leaders who would who don't want to sacrifice their own likability for the sake of maintaining the values of the institution, right? Just to go back to the Tom Cotton example, one response to that by the publisher of the New York Times would have been, if you feel that a particular op-ed makes you unsafe, perhaps this is not the right place for you to work.
Right.
Perhaps you should look into another line of work where you won't have to encounter ideas that you disagree with. But that's certainly not journalism. That might be religious work, frankly. Why am I optimistic, though? I'm not optimistic necessarily about the prospects for legacy media returning to old school journalistic values. But I'm extremely optimistic about what's possible in what I think of as the kind of Wild West space of journalism. If you look across the news media, many of the most, present company excluded, many of the most interesting, heterodox, independent-minded, funny thinkers and journalists and pundits, they're no longer operating inside the legacy press. They have platforms on Substack. I think of Andrew Sullivan as a fantastic example, which, by the way, he's making, I think, triple the amount of money that he was making at New York Magazine. I think of really provocative journalists. God knows we've had our disagreements, but on this topic, we're very aligned. Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi. I think of podcasters, young intellectuals like Coleman Hughes, people like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, one of the most powerful examples of cancellation at Evergreen State College. I think of Sam Harris. I think about Megyn Kelly's new podcast. So there's lots of interesting journalism happening. It's just not necessarily happening inside the legacy press. And the thing I will add, and this is one of the things that I'm most excited about, is that there's an opportunity, I think, to create new institutions. We need institutions, and I am an institutionally minded person. I'm not as rebellious as a Joe Rogan, but I think that there's an opportunity to create those new institutions in the years and decades to come, and I'm really, really excited about that.
So Bari, that is an optimistic view. I agree with you about how the media could be repositioned, but what about society itself? Because as you describe it, these legacy organizations are reacting to a reality. They're reacting to a reality of a world that has been fractured into a myriad of audiences, each of which is coming to a paper like the New York Times for a different reason. Their business model, as you accurately point out, is based on, satisfying that audience. Is there the basis to find and create bigger audiences that come to common understandings about difficult issues in society? I mean, have we lost that as an inherent ability within our democracy, and can we regain it?
Yes, I'm optimistic on this point, if only because there's a number of I've long wanted to write a column called "The Things We Agree On," because actually there's a number of things that we agree on: the dangers of big tech, the corruption of big pharma, the brokenness of, not speaking of Canada right now, but of the American healthcare system, the poverty, inequity, the fact that it is very, very hard, way too hard, especially in COVID, to get your child a good education. Most Americans, by the way, are extremely, and the polls show this, allergic to the idea of cancel culture and the religious zeal of wokeness ideology. I mean, there was a recent Cato study that showed that 62% of Americans admit to self-censoring. And that's the majority of Americans. So I really believe that there is an ability for us to come together. I think that you're totally right that right now the legacy press, as it serves an audience of like-minded people, it actually continues to polarize that audience. And so the question is, could one create a journalistic enterprise that focuses on the topics that are totally uncovered or ignored by the mainstream, that touch on some of the things we agree on? I mean, there's a bunch of topics that come to mind.
Excellent, Bari. These are great insights. The problem isn't just social media. We need to think of the impact of the legacy media on the tenor and tone.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
I really want to stress the amplification effect of a few very strident Twitter users. That does not represent the mainstream of America. Most people are not on Twitter. Most people, like the dentist in Cleveland or the accountant in Dallas, they're just going about their day. They're not thinking about all of this stuff. The problem is that most journalists live on social media and live on Twitter and are therefore following these trends. And I think in a way it's a bit like the tail wagging the dog. They're getting fixated by it and are allowing it to affect the things that they cover and what their perception is of the reader. I can't tell you, speaking of self-censorship and that statistic I told you about, 62% of Americans self-censoring, the amount of self-censorship that takes place among people whose job it is to tell the truth about the world, namely journalists, and I'd include even aspiring academics who want to get tenure, it's profound. It's absolutely profound. And I felt it even in myself, to put myself on the hook. There are topics that I have steered away from because I have thought to myself, is this really the hill I want to die on? Do I really want to be hounded and get spam calls to my phone calling me whatever smear of, whatever the smear of the day is? Do I really want to subject, and this has been true in my case, my family to harassment? Do I want, true in my case, my rabbi to get called to say that I'm a bad person, and why am I allowed to go to his synagogue?
Wow.
The answer is sometimes no. And that's the problem, is that all of the incentives are pushing in the opposite direction. They're pushing against being courageous and saying something different. And we need to find a way to incentivize courage, because without the courage, and I'm not talking about the courage to, true courage, which is going to Syria or Afghanistan and reporting on truly horrific things happening in dangerous places. I'm talking about the courage to talk about something like transgender participation in athletics. Things that should be open for debate, things that are reasonable to have different positions on. That's what I'm talking about. When it takes courage to express common sense, when it takes courage to express views that up until 5 minutes ago were totally acceptable to hold, that we're in a very dangerous place in terms of open debate and the spirit of true liberalism thriving. And that's where I think we find ourselves right now.
Well, thanks, Bari. That's what we're trying to do here on the Monk Dialogues, is just create that forum for ideas to come out. And just a reminder to our audience that if you want to debate on these topics, we've got a weekly podcast. We have our main stage debates. The purpose of the Monk Dialogues is to have conversations about big ideas, to expose ourselves to different arguments. It's entirely up to you whether you subscribe to the arguments or not. Hopefully you're having a raging debate in your house or your home right now about this conversation, because that's what the purpose of these conversations are. Bari, before we go to audience questions, I just want to remind viewers that we have a special promotion going on right now. For the first time ever, we're offering gift memberships to the Monk Debates. So as Bari said, if you want to be part of a community that does debate the difficult and challenging issues of our time, consider a gift membership for that friend or family member this holiday season. You get a 10-year plus online archive of all of our debates. You get advanced ticketing privileges for our live and online events. You get complimentary book of your giftee's choice. And you, the gift purchaser, get a Canadian tax receipt if you are a Canadian resident. You can access your gift membership right now at monkdebates.com/membership. Use the promo code MonkGift2020. Again, that's MonkGift2020 for 30% off our standard $99 annual membership. You're really helping us out and promoting this cause of civil and substantive debate. We've got all this for you, the promo code, the discount, until December 25th. So last minute Christmas shoppers, we've got you covered. Bari, we're going to go to questions. A whole bunch of them came in for you. I'm going to read them to you, and then you can reply. Stephen asks you, in this seemingly post-truth era, how can we create a common understandings when the component parts of reality are not only challenged, but out and out denied? Again, Bari, the challenges of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. I mean, we've moved past, it seems often as a culture, the very notion that there are common truths. Instead, it feels that everyone's entitled to their opinion, and in some cases, to challenge those opinions is to do some kind of violence towards them. What's your views on that?
It's a great question. For me, and I don't have a perfect answer to it, a big part of it comes in reasserting truths that I think we took for granted and right now are under tremendous siege. They're under siege they were under siege. She's leaving, let's hope, in a few months. But they were under siege very obviously by our post-truth, postmodern president, Donald Trump. But they were also under siege from a left that claims to be progressive, but in fact is anything but. And for me, the assertion of the liberal worldview, and by that I don't mean liberal in the partisan sense, but liberal in the most capacious sense of the word, the idea that everyone is equal because everyone is created in the image of God, the belief in the sacredness of the individual over the group, the belief that the rule of law and equality under the law is the foundation of a free society, the idea that mob justice is wrong and the presumption of innocence is right, the idea that not everything is about politics, that there are things that fall outside of the realm of politics, like love and relationships and art, and that when politics comes to define everything, well, we're living in a kind of humorless and sexless and pleasureless age. That I think it's very important right now. And these might seem like obvious statements, right? And certainly I took them for granted up until a few years ago. But that ideology, that thing that, whatever we call it, the Enlightenment or classical liberalism or the liberal ideal or the consensus that has seemed to exist in the West since the Cold War, all of those things that I just said to you, all of those are under siege by this new illiberal ideology that's taken root all around us, including in the very institutions that are meant to uphold the liberal order. And I really think that it's extremely important right now to resist that ideology, whether it comes from a far right that says there's no such thing as truth, there's only power, or a left that says there's really no such thing as truth. There's only victims and victimizers, and we're locked in a zero-sum struggle for power. It's about resisting a politics that says there's only the good and the pure. There's only the oppressed and the oppressor. There's only the victims and the victimizers. That's a road to hell. And I really believe that we need to return to first principles if we want a chance to recover truth again.
But Bari, how would you push back? And you know this argument that they would say, look, yes, there is this small L liberalism, a big E enlightenment. These were critical seminal events in our development as a civilization. But buried in those movements were power relationships. Power relationships that subjugated women, that subjugated minorities, that privileged, frankly, people like me, educated white males. And we love to embrace small L liberalism and the Enlightenment because, frankly, it furthers our objectives as the dominant class or the dominant race in a society that is engaged in the wholesale subjugation of these different minority, ethnic, and gender groups.
I would say that the way that we have achieved progress, and I'm speaking now of American history, is by people that seized the tools, and I'm talking now about the Constitution, which in part was signed and created by slaveholders, yes, who were guilty of horrible moral hypocrisy, or who seized the tools of the Enlightenment, yes, created by dead white guys who probably wouldn't have seen me as fully human, as a gay, Jewish, whatever. By seizing those tools and saying, let's use them for ourselves. Let's broaden the understand. Let's use these tools because they're the best tools that were created ever. Despite the fact that they were designed by dead white men, they were the best tools for human progress that have ever been devised. What's a better tool for human progress? Violence or a conversation? What's a better tool for human progress? The idea that everyone's created in the image of God, or the idea that some people are born into original sin by dint of their parentage or their lineage or their color? I know which side I would choose. And if you look at, let's just say, the abolitionist movement, it was people like Frederick Douglass who saw in the Constitution the ability to create a kind of second founding. It was Martin Luther King who said, this is the promissory note to which all Americans now fall heir. It was the use of those tools that led to their expansion to an increasing number of groups, especially in this country. If you want to say to me, let's throw out those tools entirely, well, what tools do we have to replace them with? Frankly, they don't look really good to me. They look like the tools of public shaming, of punishment, of making people irredeemable without any chance for mercy or grace. They look like an insistence that some people are born better than others. And I just absolutely reject those ideas. They repulse me. and they will bring us back to the mean of history, which frankly, given who I am, is not a place that I want to go anytime soon. Yes, do we have flaws in the West? Absolutely. I mean, have I suffered the kind of things that you're talking about by dint of my identity? Probably. When I look to other societies that live by the kind of logic or rules that the sort of illiberal liberals want us to take us to, that's not a society that I want to live in. So I would say, absolutely. Have people been left out in the West? Yes. But the way that the West has progressed, or I'm speaking now of America, is by a kind of identity politics. You know, Jonathan Haidt, who I'm sure has spoken on Monk Debates in the past, so brilliant. He speaks, I think, so articulately about good identity politics and bad identity politics. Good identity politics says, I've been left out. Let me tell you about my own experience so that you can understand me better and so that you can let me in. That's good identity politics. It's expansive identity politics. What we have right now too often is a dominant identity politics mode that says, you can never understand me. You can never understand me. And there's no point in you even understanding me. And so we're going to be locked in this kind of power struggle indefinitely. And I just don't think that that sounds anything like progress or frankly, anything like a society that I would want to live in.
I got it, Bari. Great analysis, great insights. Let's go to our next question board here for you. It's from Constantanios. He's asking, is there even one media outlet in the United States that reports the news in a manner that is perceptive of viewers and readers who wouldn't, in a sense, have a clue of that reporter's own opinions and political preferences? So effectively asking you, Bari, is there a neutral media left? I mean, we covered that a bit in our opening remarks together, but can you point to any outlets now that you would direct people towards as examples of this maybe new school of journalism that you're excited about?
So I would say that if you're looking for the kind of the most neutral, objective take on the news, I would read the Wall Street Journal's news section. I will say, though, when I used to work there, I'm a big fan of a lot of what they do. There's a reason that the New York Times, I think, can be a bit more fun to read, and it's because it has a voiciness that I think I, as a reader, and lots of other readers really enjoy. But what I do right now is I read a lot more than I used to.
Okay.
I read the Wall Street Journal, I read the New York Times still, for sure, and I read lots of journalists. And what I would say is, this is not something that most readers do that are not professional journalists, but pay attention to bylines. There are certain reporters that I really, really, really trust. Michael Powell is a great example at the New York Times of someone who I always want to read because I really trust him. Our China reportage, the New York Times China reportage is excellent. So unfortunately, it puts the burden on the reader more than it should be, but you should read everything with a bit more skepticism and just try and read more. And I would say venture out into the Wild West territory of journalism and start following some of the names that I mentioned before. I think that you will find that they're covering topics that are just overlooked by the mainstream press. A really good example of this is Zaid Jilani, who freelances around, Michael Tracy, who's been covering what's been happening in American cities over the summer. There's a huge list. I'm happy to send around a reading list.
Yeah, we'll put it on our website. Yeah, no, these are great. And as you said, to remind viewers who may not be familiar with Substack, check it out. It's a really interesting email kind of subscription model that a lot of journalists have gone to with real success, and it's producing some terrific analysis and reporting. Let's go to our next board for you. It comes from Larry. Larry asks, I think it's clear that the election of President Trump was in some ways a response to and a rebuttal of mainstream media's political correctness. We now anticipate a swing back to that MSM consensus view with the incoming Biden administration, at least that's Larry's view. How does this movie end? So where are we at, Bari? Is this like a ping pong game that we're gonna kind of bounce around ideologically based on whichever incumbents in the White House, and the mainstream media kind of follows the ball back and forth? Is that to the benefit of readers and viewers?
That's a really good question. I don't think we're even close to the end of this movie, to use your metaphor. Um, I think that the ideology that has swept through the legacy press, that had its nucleation point in the universities, and then has, the old idea, right, was that the radical views that students were marinating in on campus, and this was a view shared by Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, was radical ideas. But, as these students make their way in the world and they get their job in McKinsey or JP Morgan or the New York Times or the halls of Congress, they'll leave those ideas behind. And the good news and the bad news is that ideas really matter. And when you're marinating in a particular set of ideas during the most formative years of your intellectual life, those have an impact on you. And so rather than young people, and this movement is really coming from young people leaving those ideas behind, they've taken it inside of the institutions, which is why you see now, and it's not just the press and it's not just universities, it's K through 12 education, it's publishing houses, it's Hollywood, it's big tech, and it's increasingly corporate America. So I think that this movement that I am really fixated on, because I think it's one of the undertold stories of our time, the way that it is managed to capture so many of our institutions, I think it's going to continue to roll through them, not especially, but I think it's going to continue to roll through them, and it's going to continue to be unscrutinized by a press that otherwise should be telling us this extremely important story. It's a story that I want to continue to tell, and that is, if culture is downstream from politics, which I've always believed that, then it's going to continue to find its way, I believe, inside the mainstream of the Democratic Party in the years to come. But let's see if I'm proven wrong.
Fascinating stuff. Let's go to our next question. We're going to try to get through as many of these as we can. We had a lot of questions for Bari this week. How does the internet deepen the so-called paradox of intolerance? Here I'm referring to Karl Popper's famous formulation that in order to maintain a tolerant society, we must be intolerant of intolerance. I mean, this is something you've thought a lot about, Bari, as a person who has campaigned and taken a strong view on anti-Semitism in its various guises and forms. I mean, to what extent is intolerance valid? Because we are trying to stamp out those intolerant beliefs to create that space of tolerance where a civic dialogue can occur. These are difficult, blurry lines to color within.
Going back to something I said before, and it's a brilliant question, there absolutely should be intolerance for bigotry. The question is, what is bigotry? Is it bigotry to say I support Black Lives Matter as a thought, but I don't support the organization Black Lives Matter because I don't believe in abolishing the nuclear family, or I don't believe in defunding the police or unraveling capitalism, which are all tenets of the organization. In our current milieu, too many people in too many positions of power want to say that that's bigotry. I don't think that that's bigotry. To give you another example, is it bigotry to say that there are differences between men and women? Is it bigotry to say that, let me think of a good example, there are just so many examples. Is it bigotry to, and this is, I'm thinking now of a professor at Skidmore College, to go and watch as a bystander a Blue Lives Matter march through town? He was then deemed by his students to be unsafe because of that. Is it bigotry to, I could go down I'll give you another example. Is it fair to hold family members accountable for the bigotry or past bigotry of their relations? An example that I always think about when this topic comes up is Majdi Wadi. He's a Palestinian business owner in the Midwest. He runs a company called Holy Land Catering. It's a really successful catering and restaurant company, or at least it was until tweets that his daughter had put out when she was 14 and 15 years old, which were unapologetically racist and anti-Semitic. They were wrong, were ousted. Now, she apologized. He fired her from the business. but his business was still decimated. He lost his lease. He lost a lot of his major contracts. Is that, I mean, to use my language, is that American? Is that liberal? Is that fair? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm not talking about taboos on Holocaust denial. I'm not talking about taboos on discriminating against people because of their skin color or their gender or using racial slurs. I'm talking about an attempt to widen beyond reasonable recognition the boundaries of what bigotry is, and then therefore smearing people as bigoted as a way to remoralize society and narrow what is an acceptable position, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
no, I got it. Let's keep moving through these questions. Our next one up is from Raj. He's asking, free speech from the mouth of leaders like Trump has caused considerable damage to the norms of political discourse. How can society address and manage this going forward? There's been attempts, Bari, and I wonder what your thoughts are of, Twitter coming out and putting disclaimers on the president's tweets. We seem to be making some efforts to kind of police discourse, I guess, in ways that arguably would lead to a more civil, substantive conversation. Or do you think those are either ineffective solutions or solutions that have their own inherent risks embedded within them?
Yeah, I'm real skeptical of the discernment of companies like Twitter and others on this score, simply because, it's all well and good, fine, have a disclaimer next to Trump's tweet. But then if there's a disclaimer next to Trump's tweet and you still allow the supreme leader of Iran, who is peddling out and out Holocaust denial and blood libels on your website, then where's your standard? That's my problem with a lot of these new rules that I see taking place. You can get booted from the platform indefinitely if you misgender someone or use the wrong pronouns, and yet you're allowed to remain on the platform if you are a medieval anti-Semite. That doesn't seem to me to be a consistent principle.
Okay, good point. Let's go on to the next question. We'll get through as many of these as we can. Up next is Lori. She's asking, Trump has been very supportive of Israel. How do you think the incoming Biden administration will be vis-a-vis its Israel position? And do you see an impact on anti-Semitism in the U.S.? Bari, this is another deep area of expertise for you. You've worked as a journalist at Haaretz. You've written a book on anti-Semitism. What is your view right now of the challenge of anti-Semitism in our society today? And what's Trump's legacy? He was a man who incited a lot of polarization and division in society, but he also took a very pro-Israel stance in a number of ways.
So I think on this score and on many others, it's important to hold two truths at once, which is something that people seem to have a hard time doing these days. I was a very, very outspoken critic of Donald Trump. People can Google my name and Bill Maher's to see what I said about the president the Friday after the massacre in the synagogue where I was bat mitzvahed. I'm on the record saying lots of critical things about him, and that's what I believe. I believe that, as my old colleague at the New York Times, Bret Stephens, put it, that Donald Trump dismantled the moral guardrails that keep bigotry down. He stoked polarization if it was good for his own politics. He suggested at his worst that some Americans were more American than others when he was trying to criticize the squad, people like AOC and Ilhan Omar. Those are tropes that, as a Jew, are very, very dangerous, and they get my spidey senses up. So there's no question in my mind that Donald Trump was a man who had no use for the better angels of our nature. And he was absolutely guilty of creating an atmosphere at home where bigotry that used to live in the basement came out of the closet. And we saw that most tragically in Pittsburgh, but also in Poway, also on the streets of Brooklyn. So that's a problem. On the other hand, if Donald Trump, who's a man that I disagree with on many things, goes out and says the sky is blue, I'm not going to say the sky is orange. And on lots of foreign policy matters, I was cheering what he did. hawkishness towards China being one of those things, but the moving of the embassy toward Jerusalem, the recognition of the Golan Heights, and of course, most importantly, the normalization of Israel through the Abraham Accords. And I think we might see another one in the coming days if my sources are right. So it's possible to both criticize the man and recognize that there were certain things, certain policies that he got very right. I think that those of us who care a lot about the Middle East are concerned about whether or not the Biden administration will pursue a re-entry into the Iran deal. But let's see. Joe Biden has historically been a moderate inside the party, has been a friend of Israel. So lots of people I know are optimistic. But I think the thing that would mitigate against optimism is the fact that the energy in the party right now seems to be with not with the centrists, not with the Chuck Schumers and the Nancy Pelosi's, but with people like AOC. So again, we have to see. But if we can learn anything from the Republican Party since the Tea Party days, so going back about a decade until the culmination of that movement with, I would say, the election of Donald Trump, we know that there's no law of gravity that says that the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, needs to remain as it always has been. We're living in times in which change is happening at an insanely rapid speed. And I think it's entirely possible that the Democratic Party could go through the kind of transformation that we've seen the Republican Party already go through.
Okay, we'll have to see what happens. Barry, you've been hugely generous with your time. With all of our dialogue participants, we've been asking for book recommendations to kind of help us think through this moment we're in, the issues that we're confronting as a society. There's 3 books that you've suggested we take a look at. I'd like you to just give us a quick synopsis of each. The first is that classic, Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. Why did you pick that book?
I will now quote Andrew Sullivan and say, use the headline of one of his most brilliant columns that he published a few years ago, which was, "We all live on campus now." The Closing of the American Mind was a book written by Alan Bloom about what was happening on college campuses in terms of exactly what the title expresses. But the same could be said of the country in general right now. It's not just about campus. It's that the mores and the closed-mindedness and the social censure and the spirit of liberalism that's taken hold on too many college campuses has now taken root in the society in general. I can't think of a more relevant book.
Wow, thanks, Barry. Let's go to your next suggestion, The Captive Mind. Tell me about it. Why did you pick that?
I wanted to pick books that all had the word mind in the title. The Captive Mind, and I can never pronounce his name, Milosh, was written in the 50s, and it is, my God, I got chills when I read it. I've read it a few times now in the past few years, and it explains the different modes that people employ when they're trying to either live inside a closed society, rebel against it, accommodate toward it. And I got an amazing email the other day from a woman who referenced Kettman, which is one of the words he uses to describe the strategy. And she said she was employing it in her own place of work as at an American university. Again, a book that really speaks to our time. It's strange to say that because it was written about a closed society. We live in an open one. And yet I think any reader will recognize the typologies that he lays out being extremely relevant today.
Terrific. And your final book recommendation, Fear No Evil.
Oh my God. Fear No Evil is written by one of my heroes. Thank God he's still alive and doling out his wisdom, this time from Jerusalem. It's written by Natan Sharansky, one of the most prominent Soviet dissidents who suffered for his desire to leave the Soviet Union and to move to the state of Israel, which is a place that he lives today. It's a classic memoir of his time in the Gulag. He spent, I believe, 9, maybe 10 years there, again, for the crime of simply wanting to immigrate. And his is a story that I think is extremely relevant for our moment. I know I've said that about the past 2 books, but let me explain why for just 1 minute. Right now, there is no Gulag in America or in Canada. There is no social credit system like that exists in China. Yes, there's fear of social censure. There's fear of not being invited to the right dinner parties. There's fear of losing professional prestige or maybe even a promotion. But reading that book, Fear No Evil, and his most recent book, Never Alone, is a reminder of what people actually have had to suffer for the sake of living in truth and telling the truth. And reading that book is a great reminder to those of us who need a little spine stiffening of what real sacrifice looks like, and a reminder that if the worst that we suffer is that we lose a few fair weather friends, or if we lose some professional prestige, or if we lose some invites to the right dinner parties, God knows that I have, well, that's really nothing in the scope of what other real heroes have suffered.
Bari, I just want to thank you. You know, this is the culmination of 20 dialogues that we've done this year, and our conversation with you just really captures perfectly the spirit of these evenings. Our ability to have conversations about difficult issues, to express complicated ideas with incredibly lucid and thoughtful analysis, and to do all this in a civil and substantive way. I just really appreciate your time, your contributions to the learning of our community.
My pleasure.
Great, ladies and gentlemen, that was Bari Weiss, and that does wrap up this season of 2020 Monk Dialogues. 20 shows in all. It's been terrific to have you along for this journey. I found it personally just incredibly satisfying and stimulating during this pandemic. It's kind of kept me going, as I hope it's kept many of you going, with food for thought, one conversation to the next. Just a reminder that we do have a special gift membership that we're making available for the first time. You can buy a membership for that friend or family member who loves debate across the Christmas table. Well, maybe it won't be the table this year, maybe it's the Christmas Zoom call, but you can get that family or friend who loves provocative debate a gift membership to the Monk Debates, all the benefits outlined there. Simply log on to our website, www.monkdebates.com/membership, and we'll give you 30% off for listening to this show. For being part of the Monk Dialogue, simply pop in the promo code MONKGIFT2020 to get that discount. Offer valid until December 25th. Coming up right now, we've got our season finale post-dialogue members-only conversation with Janice Gross-Stein. We're going to go through the last 10 episodes this autumn. What are the key points, the key takeaways that we should be thinking about as we head into 2021? We're going to get into that right now with you, with Janice Gross-Stein. Simply go to our website if you have not already registered as a member. It's free. www.monkdebates.com/membership, and we'll email you a link right now. We'll also stick a link in the Facebook chat for this dialogue going on right now. Finally, I'd just like to thank a great group of sponsors who've helped us all year long bring these dialogues to you. Obviously, first and foremost, the Peter and Melanie Monk Charitable Foundation, who make all of this possible. Our presenting sponsors, Onyx and Gluskin Chef. Our supporting sponsors, Torrey's LLP, Bond Brand Loyalty, and Cassette Media, and a great group of media partners taking these dialogues to radio, television, podcasts all across North America and around the world. And finally, just a personal note of thanks here to Amber Mac Media, to Chris, who's been a fantastic technician behind the scenes putting this whole thing together, and to my friend Mark, who's been an essential part of this program, again, behind the scenes, making all these graphics and guests look terrific. And finally, I'd have to do a shout out to Sherry Naylor, my friend who behind the scenes does everything. Frankly, she is the Monk Dialogue. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being part of our conversation this year. Come to our website. Hopefully we'll have more information and news on the dialogues going forward and the plans we are up to in 2021. Have a safe, productive, and happy holiday season. We'll speak to you in the new year. Good night.